Tanks have been around for over a century now, showing how capable they are in the field at the battles of Cambrai in World War I, the Battle of Kursk in World War II, or even at the Battle of 73 Easting during the Gulf War. Hello and welcome everyone. Today we'll be looking at how European tank technology developed over time into what we use nowadays. We'll be looking at 3 different time periods showing where tank development was at its peak. What I think the biggest turning points of tank development were the interwar period, World War II, and the Cold War. First built in 1917, the British Mark V tank was an improvement of its earlier predecessor, the Mark IV. However, the first tank to be produced was the Mark I. The Mark V was armed with two 57mm 6 CWT QF guns and 4 Hotchkiss Mark I machine guns, and its armor consisted of 6 to 14mm, which was able to stop small arms fire, but not things like artillery or mortar rounds. Although the Mark V was built and deployed near the end of World War I, it did see limited service. The Battle of Hamel and the Battle of Amiens is where it was able to show its might, fighting alongside the Australians and the Americans. While the Mark I wasn't all that impressive, major improvements were being made as the British saw the tank's poor performance on the field. Such poor performance would be seen at the Battle of the Somme, where, quote, 17 broke down on the way to their starting point at flares, end quote. But after observing the Mark I's performance in the field, this would eventually lead to the Mark V. The Mark V had major improvements. For example, it, quote, contained a new Ricardo engine that had been specifically designed for the tank, end quote, which allowed the tank to travel faster than its predecessors. It also sometimes would carry cribs, which were, quote, braced cylindrical framework, which when dropped in the trench acted as kind of a stepping stone, end quote. All of these improvements from the Mark I to the Mark V show how much tank development happened in a couple of years. Now, although the Mark Vs typically didn't come with mortars, the version shown here has a mortar on the backside of the tank, which was able to produce additional damage to enemy positions. Now the Soviets saw the success of the Mark V, and after the Great War, they decided to produce tanks of their own. Developing the BT series of tanks, the BT-5 became the fastest tank in the world at the time, clocking in at 42.5 miles per hour. Armed with a 45mm tank gun and 1 to 3 7.65mm machine guns, the armor for this tank wasn't that heavily armored because it was a light tank, meant for quickly moving around the battlefield and for light infantry support. The version shown here is the BT-7, which had improved armor. While being pretty well armed thanks to its 10 to 15mm thick armor, by the time these light tanks were put into action, they were becoming obsolete thanks to new and improved anti-tank guns being able to penetrate the armor of the light tank. An example showing this would be their use in the Spanish Civil War, where multiple BT-5s were deployed to Spanish Republican forces, but since they, quote, were intended for deep maneuver operations, not for close infantry support, end quote, most BTs would be destroyed by the nationalist forces thanks to being supplied by the Germans. These developments of newer anti-tank guns being made forced nations to make better armor for their tanks and better tank guns so they could take out the anti-tank positions leading to the tanks we see in World War II. Moving on to the World War II period, we'll be taking a look at another British tank called the Churchill Mark IV, named after Great Britain's Prime Minister during World War II, Winston Churchill. Going into World War II, the engineers who designed the Churchill, quote, had a suspension system only tailored for large trench crossing and impassable or extremely muddy terrain, end quote, which shows that the British tank-wise were still in that World War I mindset where there were trenches and lots of mud all over the battlefield which would require large tracks. The tank was armed with a 57mm tank gun and had 1 Besa machine gun, and its armor consisted of 25 to 152mm vertical based armor plating. The tank mostly played an infantry support role, mainly because of its armament and not as good armor as the Tiger or the Panther tanks, which is what it was going up against at this time. Nearing the end of the war, most of the Churchills were starting to become obsolete thanks to the newer tanks Germany was developing. Another reason could have been that more modern tanks were beginning to appear now. One such example would be the development of the Centurion at the end of the war. It was mainly developed because of the, quote, British Army's experience of the fighting in the North African deserts between 1940 and 1942, end quote, and the need for a new tank that could combat the Germans' Tiger I being deployed into North Africa. Now compared to the Mark V, the two tanks are very different, but they still share similarities, such as the big tracks for trenches. But the many improvements from the Mark V to the Churchill, such as the rotatable turret, shows that newer tank technology would need to be developed to combat enemy forces. Next, we'll be looking at the German tank that put fear into many of the Allies if they were unlucky enough to see it, the Tiger I. Probably one of the most iconic tanks during World War II, the Tiger tank was a beast during its time. Armed with an 88mm tank gun, two 7.92mm machine guns, and coming with 102mm thick armor plating, the Tiger was able to destroy tons of Allied tanks when it was in its service. Showing most of its significance on the battlefield in the North African campaign, the Tiger I didn't come without problems though. One major problem, for example, was that it was a mechanic's nightmare. When one of the inner wheels got damaged, quote, mechanics had to remove as many as 9 wheels from the outer course, undoing 54 bolts in the process, before they could access the damaged inner wheel, end quote. The fact that it took this long for Tigers to be repaired meant that whenever a Tiger got damaged, it would take some time to be repaired before it was able to get back on the battlefield, making the Tiger a rare occurrence to see on the battlefield, which rendered its usefulness during the war. After World War II, Germany was divided up into 4 parts, occupied by the British, French, Americans, and the Russians. The British, French, and American sides of Germany would evolve into West Germany, while the Russians would do the same, but make it East Germany. In the 1970s, a new tank was being developed for the Bundeswehr called the Leopard 2A4. The Leopard 2A4 is armed with a 120mm tank gun, two 7.62mm machine guns, and armored with 525mm composite armor. Composite armor was developed to switch out all metal armor, which reduced the amount of weight the tank had to carry. It was also developed because of the widespread use of high-explosive anti-tank shells now being in use by other tanks. Even with all these upgrades though, the Leopard 2A4 was still vulnerable to other weapons, one being other tanks, but another being handheld missiles. One such example would be when, quote, 8 Leopards were lost in Syria because of anti-tank guided missiles, end quote. By this time as well, most countries' tanks were equipped with the same things such as the armor and the main gun. This goes to show that while tank development was happening, other weapons were also being developed to stop more modern tanks like these. Lastly, we'll be taking a look at one of the more recent tanks in history, the Russian T-14 Armata. The T-14 Armata is Russia's latest tank. Coming with a 125mm tank gun, a 12.7mm cord machine gun, and a 7.62mm machine gun, the T-14 is definitely one of the most advanced tanks in modern-day Europe. However, putting this much technology into a single tank doesn't come without its problems. Most notably is the amount of technology put into it. Things like the automated turret and the automated reloading system for the main gun make the T-14 a very expensive tank. Seeing how expensive it is to produce one is mainly the reason we haven't seen that much of the tank itself in places like the ongoing battle in Ukraine. For example, the manufacturer of the tank, Eurovagonzavod, stated that, quote, serial production would begin in 2022 before setting the date back again to 2023, end quote. This shows that having too much technology in something can hinder its usage of it. Tanks like the American Abrams or the South Korean K1A2 are arguably better tanks. After traveling through the history of tanks and how they developed, we can see how European tanks developed and how they evolved into what those countries use today. Ranging from the interwar period, World War II, and the Cold War, tanks have come a long way from what they used to be.